When the first whispers about Eric's health began to circulate, they did not arrive as clear warnings or definitive diagnoses. They surfaced instead as pauses in conversation, as glances held a fraction too long, as meetings postponed without explanation. Concern did not announce itself loudly. It seeped into the spaces between words. At first, everyone told themselves it was temporary, another scare in a life already crowded with battles survived. Eric had always been resilient, almost mythically so. He had endured betrayals, failures, wars of ego and legacy, and still stood at the center of the family, like an immovable axis. To imagine him vulnerable felt unnatural, almost disrespectful. Yet denial, no matter how comforting, could not erase the shift in atmosphere that followed him wherever he went. As the concerns deepened, language itself began to change. Ordinary conversations took on a new gravity, as if each sentence might carry unintended finality. Compliments sounded like gratitude. Advice sounded like inheritance. Even casual disagreements softened, wrapped in restraint, because no one wanted their last words to be sharp or careless. Hugs lingered longer than usual, arms tightening as if muscle memory alone could preserve what time threatened to take away. People smiled more deliberately, not out of joy, but out of a quiet panic that told them this moment might not come again. Fear has a way of rearranging priorities, but it also distorts judgment. The closer the family gathered around Eric, the more palpable that distortion became. Love, concern, and anxiety intertwined so tightly that it became difficult to tell where one ended and another began. Decisions that once would have been debated carefully were now rushed through under the unspoken logic that time was running out. When fear of loss enters the room, patience is often the first casualty. Eric himself sensed the shift long before anyone dared to articulate it. He saw it in their eyes when they thought he was not looking, felt it in the careful way they spoke to him, as though he were made of something fragile that might crack under the wrong word. This frightened him more than any diagnosis could have. He had built his life on authority, on being the steady hand that guided others. To become the source of their fear, the center of their anxiety, felt like a betrayal of the role he had spent decades inhabiting. At the same time, Eric was not blind to reality. His body no longer obeyed him with the same reliability it once had. Fatigue crept in uninvited. Pain appeared without warning. The mirror reflected a man still strong in presence, but undeniably altered by time. He knew that pretending otherwise would only delay the inevitable reckoning. Yet knowing something intellectually does not prepare the heart to accept it. Eric found himself torn between the instinct to protect his family from worry and the equally powerful need to prepare them for a future he might not be part of. It was in this emotional fog that manipulation found fertile ground. The most dangerous manipulators rarely announce themselves as villains. They do not raise their voices or issue threats. Instead, they listen. They observe. They wait for fear to soften resistance and grief to dull suspicion. They understand that people under emotional pressure crave certainty, and they are more than willing to provide it, at a price. When concerns about Eric's health intensified, it was inevitable that someone would see opportunity where others saw only loss. The manipulation did not begin with demands. It began with concern, carefully curated and strategically expressed. Questions were framed as protection. Suggestions were disguised as compassion. Documents were presented as safeguards, not shifts in power. Each proposal came wrapped in the same argument. This was necessary. This was responsible. This was what Eric would want if he were thinking clearly about the future. The brilliance of such tactics lay in their plausibility. They did not contradict love. They exploited it. Family members found themselves agreeing to things they would have challenged under different circumstances. The fear of being seen as selfish, or worse, as ungrateful in the face of potential loss, silenced objections before they could fully form. No one wanted to be the person who complicated matters when time felt so precious. No one wanted to risk regret by refusing what might be the last request, the last recommendation, the last chance to show loyalty. Every signature carried weight far beyond ink on paper. It carried fear, hope, and the desperate desire to believe that doing something, anything, was better than standing still. Yet buried beneath that urgency was a quiet truth few were willing to confront. Decisions made under the shadow of loss are rarely free. They are shaped by panic, not clarity, and panic is easily steered. Eric watched this unfold with growing unease. He recognized the shift in dynamics, the subtle reordering of influence that occurred when people began speaking for him instead of to him. At first, he assumed it was kindness, an attempt to ease his burden. But gradually, patterns emerged. Conversations happened without him. Plans were finalized before he was consulted. His presence became symbolic rather than authoritative, invoked to justify decisions he had not fully endorsed. This realization wounded him deeply. More than the physical symptoms, more than the fear of mortality, it was the erosion of agency that cut closest to his sense of self. Eric had always believed that legacy was built through intention, through choices made consciously and defended fiercely. To see those choices redirected by others under the guise of protection felt like a quiet theft of his remaining autonomy. Yet confronting it was not simple. To object too strongly risked appearing ungrateful, even combative, at a time when everyone expected him to be reflective and conciliatory. The unspoken expectation was that illness should bring wisdom, not resistance. Eric struggled against this narrative, aware that silence would allow manipulation to harden into permanence, but equally aware that speaking up could fracture relationships already strained by fear. Around him, the family splintered into subtle factions. Some truly believed the changes being proposed were necessary, acts of prudence in uncertain times. Others sensed something was wrong but lacked the courage to challenge it openly. Fear made allies of convenience and enemies of integrity. Old resentments resurfaced, cloaked in concern for Eric's well-being. Long-standing power struggles found new justification, framed as preparation for an inevitable future. The manipulator thrived in this environment. Every hesitation was met with reassurance. Every doubt was countered with urgency. The language of loss became their most effective weapon. They spoke of what-ifs and just in case, of honoring Eric's wishes even when those wishes had never been clearly stated. They positioned themselves as guardians of stability, subtly implying that anyone who questioned them was endangering not just the future, but Eric himself. This tactic was devastatingly effective. People who loved Eric found themselves backing away from their own instincts, convinced that disagreement equaled disloyalty. The fear of regret, the fear of one day wishing they had done more, outweighed the fear of being wrong. In this way, manipulation did not need to force compliance. It simply waited for love to do the work. Eric's health continued to fluctuate, creating cycles of hope and despair that further destabilized the family. Good days inspired optimism and renewed denial. Bad days brought urgency and rash decisions. Inconsistency became the norm, and with it, vulnerability. Every downturn intensified the pressure to act quickly, to secure outcomes before it was too late. Each upturn delayed honest conversations, allowing unresolved issues to fester beneath forced smiles. In quiet moments alone, Eric grappled with his own complicity. He realized that by avoiding difficult conversations, he had inadvertently created space for others to fill the silence with their own agendas. His desire to spare his family pain had become a tool used against him. The irony was painful. In trying to protect them from fear, he had allowed fear to reshape everything he cared about. Memory became both comfort and torment. Eric reflected on the years he had spent building not just a business, but an identity rooted in control and vision. He had fought tirelessly to ensure that his legacy would be intentional, not accidental. Now, faced with the possibility of his own decline, he was forced to confront how fragile that control truly was. Legacy, he realized, was not something secured by titles or documents alone. It depended on courage, especially the courage to speak when silence felt easier. The turning point did not come with a dramatic diagnosis or a sudden collapse. It came with a small moment of clarity, quiet and devastating. Eric overheard a conversation not meant for him, one that referred to him in the past tense. Not literally, but emotionally. Decisions were being justified by what he would have wanted, without any intention of asking what he wanted now. In that moment, the truth crystallized. He was being mourned before he was gone, and in that premature mourning, his voice had been erased. That realization ignited something fierce within him. Fear still existed, but it was no longer dominant. In its place grew resolve. Eric understood that time, however limited, still belonged to him. He could not control his health, but he could control his honesty. He could reclaim his agency, even if doing so unsettled those who believed they were acting in his best interest. When Eric finally chose to speak, it was not with anger, but with devastating clarity. He addressed the fear directly, naming it without allowing it to dictate his choices. He acknowledged uncertainty without surrendering authority. He reminded them that love did not grant the right to override consent, that concern did not justify manipulation, no matter how well-intentioned it appeared. His words cut deep because they exposed not malice, but weakness, the universal human weakness of letting fear excuse actions we would otherwise question. The fallout was immediate and complex. Some felt relieved, grateful for boundaries restored. Others felt accused, defensive, even betrayed. The manipulator, exposed not through confrontation but through transparency, found their influence suddenly diminished. Without fear to amplify their arguments, their proposals lost urgency, their logic revealed as opportunistic rather than protective. Yet the damage could not be entirely undone. Some decisions had already been made, some consequences already set in motion. Eric accepted this with a quiet sadness. Reclaiming his voice did not erase regret, but it transformed it into something survivable. He could live with the outcomes now, knowing they were faced honestly rather than avoided. As the family adjusted to this new reality, conversations slowly regained their authenticity. Words no longer carried the weight of last rites, though the awareness of mortality remained. Hugs became expressions of presence rather than desperation. Love, stripped of panic, found a steadier rhythm. The fear of loss did not vanish, but it no longer ruled every decision. Eric's health remained uncertain, but uncertainty no longer equaled silence. He spoke openly about his wishes, his boundaries, his hopes. In doing so, he dismantled the manipulator's greatest weapon. Fear thrives in ambiguity. Clarity starves it. By naming his reality rather than hiding it, Eric reclaimed not just control, but dignity. In the end, the true danger had never been illness alone. It was the way fear could be weaponized, turning love into leverage and concern into coercion. Eric's greatest legacy in that moment was not a company or a fortune, but a lesson painfully earned, that even in the face of loss, perhaps especially then, no one should be pressured into decisions they will regret. Love, if it is to mean anything, must leave room for choice. And choice, Eric understood at last, was the one thing he still had the right to protect. The argument did not begin with shouting. It began with language, with the careful, deliberate way people chose their words when they thought they were being reasonable, compassionate, or pragmatic. When the truth about Will finally surfaced, about how he had not been fully conscious, how consent had been blurred beyond recognition, how pregnancy had followed, no one disputed the sequence of events. What fractured the family was how those events were named, framed, and ultimately judged. Katie understood this almost immediately. Facts alone were not what threatened to destroy them. It was the vocabulary being built around those facts, brick by brick, until it formed a structure that excused some people while condemning others, until it quietly shifted responsibility away from where it belonged. From the moment the story broke, Katie felt herself moving into a role she had never wanted but could not refuse. She was not only Will's mother, she became his interpreter, his shield, and his last line of defense against a world that preferred simplicity over truth. She watched as people leaned on familiar phrases, calling what happened a mistake, a complicated situation, a gray area. Each term felt like an erasure. Each softened word sanded down the violence of what Will had endured. Katie realized with a cold clarity that if she did not challenge the language being used, the outcome would already be decided. Words would do what actions had started: minimize, obscure, and ultimately blame the wrong person. Will himself struggled to articulate what he felt. Trauma had scrambled not just his memories, but his sense of legitimacy. He heard the debates happening around him, often without him, and began to question whether his own experience was real enough to deserve anger. He had been drinking. He had trusted the wrong people. He had laughed before things went too far. These details were repeated constantly, as if they were evidence against him rather than context for what had been taken. Watching her son absorb this rhetoric, Katie felt something inside her harden. Protection, she realized, was no longer about comfort. It was about confrontation. The pregnancy complicated everything in ways that felt almost cruel in their timing. It introduced an innocent life into a situation already saturated with moral confusion and social fear. Some family members spoke about the unborn child as if it were a reason for restraint, urging silence for the sake of stability. Others used it as justification for outrage, insisting that the consequences proved the severity of the act. Katie saw both impulses collide and explode into something unrecognizable. The pregnancy became a symbol people used to advance their own agendas, often without regard for Will's mental state or the reality that his body, his agency, had been violated. As conversations escalated, the family split along a fault line that had been forming for years. One side argued for containment. They spoke in terms of damage control, reputation management, and emotional fatigue. They insisted that dragging the situation into the open would destroy lives indiscriminately, including Will's. Their logic was seductive in its calmness. They framed silence as mercy, privacy as protection. Katie listened, furious not because they lacked concern, but because their concern prioritized comfort over justice. To her, Chanda Yen, burying it quietly, felt less like compassion and more like surrender. The opposing side wanted exposure. They believed that the only way to prevent future harm was to name what had happened publicly and without euphemism. They spoke of accountability, of setting precedent, of refusing to allow influence or status to erase wrongdoing. Their arguments were louder, more emotional, fueled by anger that had been waiting for a catalyst. Yet, even among them, Katie sensed a danger. Public battles rarely remain focused on truth alone. They attract spectacle, distortion, and opportunism. She feared that in turning Will's trauma into a public war, his pain would be consumed as content, his identity reduced to a headline. Caught between these camps, Katie felt the weight of impossible choices. Silence would mean complicity. Exposure could mean annihilation. She understood better than anyone that there was no clean path forward. The question was not how to avoid loss, but which loss could be lived with. Protecting Will did not mean choosing the option that looked safest on the surface. It meant choosing the one that allowed him to reclaim his narrative, even if that narrative made others uncomfortable. What enraged Katie most was how quickly the focus shifted away from Will's condition that night. His lack of sobriety became the central talking point, repeated so often that it began to eclipse everything else. She heard people say he was not thinking clearly, not himself, as if that somehow diluted the severity of what followed. Katie fought back against this framing relentlessly. Being intoxicated did not make Will less deserving of autonomy. If anything, it made him more vulnerable. The insistence on revisiting his impairment felt like an attempt to retroactively assign consent where none could exist. Language, Katie realized, was the battlefield. Every time someone referred to the incident as sex gone wrong, instead of exploitation, a line was crossed. Every time they used passive constructions that erased the actor responsible, responsibility dissolved further. Katie began correcting people openly, even when it made rooms go silent. She named what had happened plainly, refusing to soften it for the sake of social harmony. Each correction cost her. Relationships strained. Invitations stopped coming. But she refused to let politeness become a weapon against truth. Will's struggle intensified as the arguments around him grew louder. He oscillated between guilt and rage, shame, and confusion. Some days he wanted everything exposed, convinced that only sunlight could burn away the doubt gnawing at him. Other days he begged for quiet, overwhelmed by the idea of his most painful moment becoming public property. Katie learned to sit with these contradictions without trying to resolve them. Trauma did not move in straight lines. Neither would their response. The family gatherings became unbearable. Conversation stalled when Katie entered a room. People chose sides not just ideologically, but emotionally, aligning themselves with whichever narrative felt least threatening to their own lives. Old loyalties resurfaced. Past resentments found new justification. What should have been a collective effort to support will instead became a referendum on values. Truth versus comfort, justice versus preservation, naming versus burying. The threat to reputations loomed over everything like a silent ultimatum. Powerful names, carefully constructed images, and future plans all stood to be incinerated if the truth was pursued publicly. Katie was not naive about this. She understood exactly what was at stake. She also understood that this was precisely why silence was being encouraged so aggressively. Reputation had become a shield, one wielded by those with the most to lose and the least to answer for. As pressure mounted, Katie found herself revisiting her own past decisions, her own compromises. She wondered how many times she had chosen peace over confrontation, how often she had accepted softened truths because they were easier to live with. This time felt different. This time, the cost of silence would be borne by her child. That realization stripped away any lingering hesitation. Whatever path they chose, it would not be one dictated by fear of fallout. The public versus private debate reached its breaking point when legal options entered the conversation. Lawyers spoke carefully, outlining risks and probabilities without addressing the emotional toll. The possibility of a public case ignited panic in some corners of the family and grim determination in others. Katie listened, absorbing every warning, every threat implied or explicit. She knew that once this line was crossed, there would be no retreat. The truth would take on a life of its own. What ultimately shifted the dynamic was Will's voice. Not loud, not polished, but unmistakably his. In a moment of raw clarity, he articulated what the arguments had been missing, that being protected did not mean being erased, and being believed did not require becoming a symbol. He did not want revenge, nor did he want silence. He wanted recognition. He wanted the truth acknowledged without being transformed into a weapon or a secret. His words cut through the noise, forcing everyone to confront how far they had drifted from the person at the center of the storm. Katie stood beside him, unwavering. She understood that the road ahead would still be brutal, that no choice would spare them completely. But she also understood something fundamental. Allowing language to distort reality was itself an act of violence. Naming what happened mattered, not because it guaranteed justice, but because it restored dignity. The family remained divided, perhaps irreparably. Some continued to argue for containment, others for confrontation. Reputations would suffer. Futures would change. There was no version of events in which everyone emerged unscathed. Yet something irreversible had already occurred. The truth, once spoken clearly, could not be buried again. In the aftermath, Katie accepted the cost of her stance. She lost proximity to people she once trusted. She became a difficult presence, a reminder of a reality others preferred not to face. But she also watched her son begin, slowly, painfully, to reclaim himself. He stopped apologizing for what had been done to him. He stopped questioning whether his experience was valid enough to deserve anger. That, to Katie, was worth every burned bridge. What the family learned, though many would never admit it, was that silence is not neutral. It is a choice with consequences as real as any action. When truth is bent by language, harm multiplies quietly. Katie refused to participate in that bending. She chose to let the truth be sharp, even if it cut everyone involved. In the end, the question was never whether the truth would destroy something. It always does. The real question was what deserved to survive afterward: reputations built on denial or a future built on accountability. Katie chose the latter, knowing full well that the fire it ignited would leave scars. But she also knew that from those scars, something honest could finally begin.